All right. Good evening, at least my time now. Thank you guys for being flexible and watching this lecture instead of having it in class. My goal here is to get us through the end of interest group activities and hopefully move us into the beginning of political parties so that we are set up to be back on syllabus by the end of the day on Friday. Um, Here's to hoping. So, if you remember from our conversations on Monday, we were talking about interest groups, what their goals are, their roles in our system, right? So, the education role, the representation role, all of those sorts of things. And if you remember also what I said on Monday when we start talking about the second part of interest groups, is now we're moving more into the idea of special interests and lobbying. So, I think the way you can think about this is that all interest groups lobby, but not all entities that lobby are interest groups. Other kinds of organizations, individuals, businesses all lobby as well. And so some of the stuff we're going to talk about today is more specific to lobbying in general, but I'll try to make that distinction as we're talking through it. So the first thing that we want to talk about are the kinds of things that interest groups in particular, but also other lobbying groups do to try to influence public policy. Because again, remember, that's the whole point. Interest groups care about policy. So we're going to talk about sort of two different areas or two different arenas of action. This first one is what we call indirect action, and these are all activities designed to create public pressure. So it's indirect because it's putting or giving information to the public so that they will share it with their decision makers. It's a way to mobilize public opinion. And the goal here is really to make enough noise that the public starts paying attention and puts pressure on the decision makers that the interest group or other lobbying organization wants to impact. One of the ways to think about this is what we call activating constituents. So remember our conversation from Monday about what a set of constituents are, like all the people who are involved in or care about a particular issue. In this case, we're also talking about constituents in the sense of those people who are represented by members of Congress. So one of the best ways for interest groups and other lobbying groups to get their point across is to get a particular member's constituents really paying attention to and wanting to be active on a particular issue. That would put a lot of pressure on, for example, a member of the House of Representatives because he's supposed to be representing that group of people. And if they're activated, if they're interested in a particular issue, then that member better pay attention to what's going on. So there's sort of two ways we can do this. One is through education, right? Just sort of information that goes out or partnering with other kinds of groups to get information out to particular geographic areas linked to members' districts. And then there's also specific mobilization. So many of you guys probably belong to some kind of interest group. And probably at least once a week, you get an email from them saying something like, contact your member of Congress, or call your senator, or call the Department of Transportation, right? Or you belong to some sort of group on Facebook that puts those kinds of those calls out as well. And so that's what's going on here. It's indirect action. It's meant to both educate and mobilize average citizens, some of whom will become activists as well. But more importantly, what will happen is that those people will put pressure on decision makers, the people who are supposed to represent them. And then the other sort of piece of indirect action is what we call public protests, right? That fits into indirect action because it's not necessarily geared toward talking to a decision maker or a member of Congress directly. Right? Public protests are about attention. They're about media coverage. They are in some ways about mobilization, but not necessarily mobilization of specific constituents, but more in general, getting people to think about particular issues and to pay attention to them. So in some ways, it kind of fits into their agenda building repertoire. But protests are the other ways that interest groups choose to go outside the system. They're not dealing with decision makers directly. Now, the other tactics that we're going to talk about are much more about those kind of direct actions. And by direct action, we mean talking specifically to a decision maker, a member of Congress, an executive in one of the cabinet agencies. That's direct action. That's just a conversation, a seeking to persuade someone. But it's meant to be about personal contact. And so there can be things like, we call them scorecards, right? This is a way for interest groups to let other people know how or what their interactions have been like with these kinds of decision makers. It also is a way to publicize a decision maker's record, particularly for people who are in Congress, to say, hey, they voted with us on all these issues, or they voted against us. And the other thing that's happening is they're creating strategic alliances with other interest groups. One of the things that you'll see happening, and it's not really as obvious to the citizens or to the public, and it happens even a little bit less at the state and local level. This is primarily federal, and a lot of this is happening in Washington, D.C., and that is alliances among interest groups. You'll see groups registered to lobby that say things like, alliance for protecting the wetlands. And that will be a strategic alliance of a number of different, say, environmental interest groups. By the way, if you hear sort of random background noise, that's my dog. And I have no idea what she's going to do next. So hopefully she will stay content and quiet in the background here. Anyway, that's the goal. Their goal is always to do whatever they need to do to put as much pressure on as they can, which may mean bringing other people together. One of the most interesting things that I've ever seen is that those strategic alliances can mean, strange combinations of interest groups. So this is less of an issue now, but back before people used the internet to a great degree, so this is probably up until the mid-1990s, there's a lot of protests that went on in front of adult bookstores. That was the primary way in which people got pornography when there wasn't the internet. And there's the dog. But one of the interesting things is that the people that you would see protesting those kinds of places were a combination of women's groups like the National Organization of Women and religious conservatives. And so I've heard these great stories about how they would have to form like separate picket lines in front of these stores so that they wouldn't be able to talk to each other about all the things they disagreed about, but were only talking about the things that they agreed about, which was trying to shut down these adult bookstores. And the other option for strategic alliances is that gives interest groups access to their alliance partners' constituents as well. So it's just more citizens, more people to be able to pay attention to these issues. At the end of the day, we're talking primarily about personal contact when we're talking about direct action. And this can be with the president. Let's go back here. This can be with the president. It can be with the executive agencies. There's even ways for interest groups and other kinds of lobbying groups to try to lobby the court system. Now, it's through filing briefs with the court. These are called amicus curiae briefs, friend of the court briefs, that lay out an argument about legal decision making. And we'll talk more about those when we get to the judicial section. But recognize this, that there is lobbying that goes on in all levels and all branches of government. And it just depends on what kinds of things we're talking about. So lobbying is really about the trading of information, right? So remember on Monday when we talked about how important information is to interest groups. Well, for lobbyists, this is what they do. They are constantly going in and out of people's offices trading information. And this is not necessarily nefarious at all, right? Like, it's not like they're trading secret information, but their job is to build this network of people who have information and connect them with decision makers, right? So they stand in the centerpiece of these kind of networks, and that's what they end up doing. Now, one of the things that happens, or one of the reasons why they can stand in the middle of these networks, is something we call the revolving door. What that means is that people who are the most successful lobbyists are people who have served in the positions of the people that they are lobbying. So if you want to be a successful lobbyist to members of the House of Representatives, run for the House of Representatives and then become a lobbyist, because people who have been in the House of Representatives are the most successful lobbyists. The same thing works with the executive branch agencies as well. In fact, that's what we mean by the revolving door. There are lots of people who started out in positions, for example, in the Department of Energy, who leave the public service or leave government service and join on as a lobbyist with a firm lobbying the people they used to work with in the Department of Energy, because they've gotten all this expertise, right? Some of that will make more sense when we get to the executive branch and the bureaucracy and talk about the importance of expertise in that role. But that's what's happening when we talk about the revolving door. When you're lobbying, what you're doing lots of times is having private meetings, right? This is the sort of classic picture of what we think of when we think about lobbying, right? In a member of Congress's office, right? Over drinks at a party, right? Just having a conversation, trading information, explaining the policy position of the group or the interest that you're working for. And that's lots of what happens, but that's not really the only thing that goes on. Lobbying also involves what we think of as testimony. So, you watch C-SPAN in the middle of the night and you're seeing people testifying in front of congressional committees about different kinds of policies, different ways that they might be implemented. And that's lobbying as well, too, because they're sharing information. They're sharing expertise. They're trying to convince those decision makers to do a policy in a particular way. Now, this can happen both in Congress and for the agencies. But the most interesting piece of this can go on to even be that lobbyists and interest group representatives are writing bills. Now, to be perfectly honest, most of the evidence we see for this is at the state level, which, if you think about it, makes sense given that most state legislatures don't meet full time. Right? They don't pay people enough to have that as their full-time job. And so what's going on in state legislatures is lots of time these are people who are they're only part-time legislators. So they're only thinking about these issues part of the time. And so interest groups step in to help them write effective bills. And this is particularly true in states that don't have legislative services opportunities in the state house, basically lawyers who help members of state legislatures write bills. Now, obviously in Congress, that's a full-time job and people spend all of their time doing that. But still, there can be help or assistance from lobbyists and interest group representatives writing bills that do policy in the way that they want them to. And that's particularly the case when we're talking about regulatory orders, right? So remember our conversation on Monday about the different kinds of law. Well, lobbyists do, in fact, have a lot of input in how regulations are put into place. And so that's another way that interests and interest groups are lobbying decision makers. At the end of the day, it's all about information. Information about what constituents want, information about views of other members of Congress or other executive officials, information about plans and future prospects for elections or just for decisions that come out of the White House or from another cabinet agency or from one of the independent executive agencies that's tasked specifically with this policy area. Now, interest groups and lobbyists are also involved in campaigns. Now, this is a little bit more complicated of a subject in the sense that, lobbying is just sharing information, right? You sit down, you talk to somebody, you try to convince them of something. Campaigns is another one of those indirect methods, but it's less about convincing and persuasion and more about sort of working at the front end to get people elected who are going to be persuadable and using money to make that happen. So I'm going to talk a lot about campaign finance in a minute. There are some important pieces to this, but again, a lot of this stuff is stuff that I want you to know so that you understand how to make good decisions as a citizen. So there are some ways in which interest groups provide volunteers to campaigns, right? Again, it depends on what level of campaign you're talking about. But for lower level campaigns, and remember, most campaigns are state oriented, right? Only the president is a campaign that crosses state lines. And so interest groups can provide or can help to recruit volunteers to do things for campaigns, like canvas or stuff envelopes or things like that. But at the end of the day, the vast majority of the influence that interest groups are going to have on campaigns, interest groups and lobbyists, is through money. Now, there's a couple ways that the campaign money is structured. You're going to want to read this section in your book. It's going to make a lot more sense seeing it on the page, plus you can reference back and forth because, again, it is complicated. The important thing to know is that this conversation is only about federal offices. State-level campaign finance varies dramatically from state to state. And so when I'm talking about federal offices, I'm talking about the House of Representatives, the Senate, and the President. Everything else is governed by state laws, and those are everywhere from very restrictive and focused on small donations and public funding to places where there are no campaign finance rules at all. All right, so let's talk about some of the avenues that interests, whether we're talking about businesses or organizations or nonprofits, have when they work on campaigns. Now, remember, all sorts of organizations do this, right? Universities have lobbyists, and big hospital systems that are nonprofit have lobbyists. And so political action committees are a way for organizations to move campaign money. Now, these are specifically regulated, and they are $5,000 in and $5,000 out. This means that you can write a check for $5,000 as an individual to a political action committee, and they can give $5,000 to any candidate. And lots of organizations can contribute to political action committees, and corporations can contribute to political action committees. Now, but remember that businesses are not allowed to directly contribute to candidate campaigns. Now, you may ask yourself, wait a minute, why are we talking about political action committees? Why don't we just give money to campaigns? Because there are contribution limits for those as well. And you cannot give more than $2,000 to an individual campaign in an election cycle. So that's where PACs come in, is that their job is to basically hedge your bets. Right? Because what the PAC is doing is it's making strategic decisions about where to spend money. And you're basically, as a citizen, trusting that PAC, right, who shares an ideological position that you have or shares the interest of some lobbying group to say, okay, you're going to have a better idea of where this money is better spent. But here's the thing. Political action committees, you would think, well, that's not a huge amount of money, right? $5,000 per cycle is not a ton of money. Where political action committees really do their most or create their most influence is in their list of donors. Because what they can do is that, yes, they'll take your $5,000, but what they can do is they can have a dinner and they can say, you, wealthy donor, you're allowed to contribute $2,000 individually to every congressional campaign. And we're going to invite 100 of you to come in, and we'll say to you 100 people, here is our list of 20 members of Congress that we really think that your money will help. So you should write individual checks. So that means every person in there is going to write $40,000 worth of checks, which in some cases is not a whole lot of money for them. But the important thing is this: if you have 100 people in a room writing $2,000 checks, if they all do it for all 20 of the people that you are supporting, then all of a sudden you can go to that member of Congress as the leader of the Political Action Committee and say, hi, here is $200,000, because all 100 of those people wrote $2,000 checks. That's where they get their influence, because they've got the ability to manipulate these lists of large money donors. But at the end of the day, it is about hedging your bet, and it's about allowing that Political Action Committee to help wealthy donors make decisions about who to give money to. Now, this is long-standing. These political action committees have been in existence since the passage of the campaign finance laws of 1974, right? So these are, and particularly the Supreme Court decisions that came out of those. So these are over 40 years old. Most of the time, what we hear about now is what we call independent expenditure. So you can see here, this is the growth of political action committees over time. And we know that there's a considerable amount of political action committees that are pulling in money and directing donors. So most of the time, what we're hearing about when we talk about money in elections is we're talking about independent expenditure groups. And they're different, because independent expenditure groups are not about campaign money. Right? What we were talking about before, the $2,000 limit, the political action committees, those are campaign money explicitly. Independent expenditure is about people using their First Amendment rights to create political advertising without coordinating with the candidate. This is why when you see a campaign ad for a federal office, they always say right at the end, like, you know, I am, or this is so-and-so, let's think here, who in Ohio? Okay, so this is Jim Renacci and I approved this message, right? That means that it was his campaign that created that ad. What you'll hear a lot of times, though, is that, you know, ad paid for by, there's all these different names for these independent expenditure groups, but like Americans for Greater Liberty, right? They're all kind of like generic-y, patriotic names like that. But that means that that's an independent expenditure ad that you're seeing. Independent expenditure ads are unlimited donations, and there's a whole long, complicated reason why that's the case. But primarily it's because they're supposed to be separate from the campaigns. We limit speech in the form of money to campaigns because we're afraid that that will corrupt campaigns, but we can't, or the Supreme Court has said we cannot limit free speech even if it's about campaigns, if we're not giving that money directly to candidates. And so independent expenditure organizations can have unlimited donations, and they can get donations from labor unions and large corporations. That's what the Citizens United decision in 2010 did. Is it basically said it didn't make it legal for businesses to give money directly to candidates, but it did make it legal for them to give money directly to independent expenditure organizations, which means that these groups, these independent expenditure organizations called, and it's a bad name because it doesn't make any sense in this context, but this is what a super PAC is. And super PACs can have hundreds of millions of dollars. And that's where it comes from, these huge donors and big businesses. Now, the thing is that there are other large groups that create or that have independent expenditure organizations that collect money. But parties tend to operate in a slightly different legal framework. So they're not candidates, but they're also not fully independent expenditure organizations. And so they operate in, it's not really a gray area, but they're allowed to use money, but they're only allowed to use money for party building and get out the vote. But they still can make a lot of independent expenditure to do those things because, particularly in the context we live in today, getting out the vote is actually really, really important. So you can think about parties in the context of independent expenditure as well. And then there's lots and lots of issue advertising, right? That's not specifically geared toward a particular candidate, but just like you see this a lot for social issues. You'll see this for healthcare and immigration, sort of hot topics where people know which side of the fence each party is on. And so that's the kind of independent expenditure issue advertising that we'll see. 527s were the original version of this. We don't hear about them much anymore because of Citizens United and the creation of super PACs. Now, much of this has to do with the most recent comprehensive changes in campaign finance, and that is from the BCRA, the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, and the Bipartisan Campaign Finance Reform Act, BICRA, or McCain-Feingold, that was passed in 2003. What it did was it basically limited the amount of monies that parties could spend on party building and get out the vote. But it's still a pretty large number. So it's not, it has to be disclosed, right? That's really the primary issue here, is that you cannot privately give huge piles of money to a party and not disclose it. It has to be disclosed through the federal financial system. And the BICRA actually put into place advertising rules about independent expenditure advertising not being allowed to run a certain number of days before a primary and general elections, but those parts were struck down by the Supreme Court. And 527s came almost directly out of the BICRA. Citizens United changed this. It created an enormous amount of money that's available through super PACs, through corporate spending. At the end of the day, super PACs still are what we call disclosed donations. So because they operate under the original laws that governed political action committees, that means that the information donors have to be disclosed. That's true for members. That's true for any campaign. They have to disclose their donors and how much, and super PACs do as well. But the reality is this, like, here's why we care about all of this, and here's why I've spent the last 10, 15 minutes talking through this campaign finance stuff, and why we're talking about it now in the context of interest groups and lobbying, not in elections. And that's because we know that interest groups, other kinds of interest organizations, corporations, anybody who's got a lot of resources and can put them into issue advertising, independent expenditure, and campaigns, are having an impact on the kinds of policies that are created. And that's lobbying, or that is the definition of influence, right? So that's why we care about these things, because much of the perceived influence of particular actors, of interest groups, of large corporations, of the National Petroleum Association, has to do with the amount of money that they can spend in elections. Why? Because members of Congress need to be elected, they need to be reelected, and to do that, they need money, and they need more and more money to do that. So what does that mean? Well, generally speaking, it creates a pretty significant amount of what we think of as representational inequalities, right? We talked on Monday about this idea of representational multipliers, right? Things that help you get more representation. Well, money works that way, and money is one of the biggest of the representational multipliers. That's made even more obvious when we think about the kind of resource inequalities that are inherent in an interest system, right? So we started this conversation on Monday talking about, citizens groups and who joins, and the fact that people who have more education, more or higher socioeconomic status are more likely to join. Well, just think about that on a huge scale, and what you're going to get is a situation where the people who have the most influence over the people who make decisions are those with money, and existing money and power and influence and education. And so it makes it pretty complicated, and it makes it very hard for people to gain access to their representatives if they don't have money or influence of some way. And that's just sort of it's a reality of our system. There are a lot of ways we can talk about fixing that. Hopefully we'll have some time on Friday to do some group work about that. But at the end of the day, because the Supreme Court has consistently ruled that money is speech, money allows people to have more of a say in the kinds of policies that are created in Congress and among decision makers. It's also created a situation where there's a fairly privileged position of business corporations. And that's true in terms of the amount of money they bring. But you can also think about it this way, right? So I don't remember who said this. This was one of our mid-century presidents. It might have been Eisenhower, who said, the business of America is business, right? And what that means is that the interest of businesses, large and small, drive a lot of the decision making in the United States. Because being a capitalist system, people's ability to feed their children, have livelihoods, and this middle-class standard of living is based on businesses being able to continue to create profits. Well, so that also means that government has the incentive to create policies that allow businesses to have more profits. Right? So this is one of the challenges in thinking about the connectedness between capitalism and our democracy. This is not to say that that is necessarily a bad thing at all. We know for a fact, right, that capitalism is much more productive than pretty much any other of the economic systems. But it does mean that we have to pay attention to the impact of that system on our democracy. Because there are two things that we've combined that aren't necessarily automatically fit together. What we're going to talk about if we have some time to do group questions on Friday is a conversation about how we might think about the influence of money in politics. And would we want to move towards something that's more along the lines of having spending limits for people in campaigns, or more and more comprehensive disclosure practices? So when we think about those representational inequalities that come out of that process, we know that power goes to the most organized, which means people who have the most resources. Advocacy groups tend to focus on groups of people with higher incomes, education than the general public. And so they tend to focus on the quality of life issues for people with higher incomes, not on sort of the basic needs of people with lower incomes, because they're just not as well represented. We know that across the board, business interests dominate the lobbying sphere, right? So this is the, I think these are 2015 data, that there are 1,500 pharmaceutical industry lobbyists, and all the other interests together spend only a fraction as much as those pharmaceutical industry lobbyists. Political action committees tend to, across the board, represent wealthy interests. Why? Because they're about collecting money from wealthy donors. That's like their reason for existence. And what I've got here is the major spending on federal lobbying in 2011 by industry sector. So what you can see is that the healthcare sector is spending pretty much by far and away the most amount of money. But insurance and real estate, that makes a big difference. That's part of the equation. Energy and natural resources, these things make a really big impact on what kinds of things members of Congress, the kind of information that they hear comes from people who have higher money interests in mind. And so, so that'll be the group question. What I want to do now is just to go ahead and start the conversation about political parties, so that we will be at least a little bit ahead. So when we talk about political parties, we're talking about a group of political activists who are organized to win elections, operate the government, and determine public policy. Now, remember from our earlier conversations, the differences between interest groups and political parties, right? Political parties' goal is to win elections. They can't do anything else until they win an election. And so they will change their policy preferences. They will change the people who are running in order to make sure that they're winning elections. Interest groups care about policy, right? They're trying to get particular kinds of policies and interests represented. And so that may mean they have to change who they're allied with. They have to change parties in order to get to their policy. But so that's how you can tell the difference in terms of what their goals are, and those different goals impact how they're structured. Plus, political parties operate under a more complex set of laws for the most part because they are involved with elections, which are part of our constitutional system. So political parties really have three primary functions in our system. The first and foremost is to win elections. And I'm going to keep coming back to this over and over again. Issues and positions are supportive goals in order to win elections. Why? Because it doesn't matter what you think or what policy you espouse if you don't win, right? If you don't win an election. And so what do they do in order to win elections, or how do they work to how do they work out this function? Well, the first thing they do is recruit candidates for office. Now, for federal elections, most of the time people have decided to run and they announce it and things like that. But by the time we get there, this whole idea, remember our idea of and progressive ambition has kicked in by the time you get to federal offices. Parties spend a ton of time recruiting candidates for office way down at the local and state level, right? It's actually parties, particularly state parties, spend a lot of time recruiting people to run for state legislatures and to run for school boards and county commissions and things like that. So that's what they're doing, is that they are recruiting candidates so that they can compete and they can have good candidates so they can win those elections. Parties actually also organize elections. Now, this is kind of strange, but think about it in particular in terms of primaries, right? Primary elections are about choosing party representatives to run in the general election. And because of that distinction, the court has over and over again ruled that parties get to decide who their representatives are. And so in that sense, they really organize elections at the beginning, right? They're the ones who decide whether you have you choose your nominee through a caucus or through a primary voting system. They're the ones who decide when the primaries are, all this kind of stuff. They're organizing elections. And they're really focused on the primaries, at least initially, because they're really running the show. Because it's about people sort of moving up or coming to the top in the parties in order to be candidates for those offices. Parties also run nomination conventions, and that's true at the state level. It's much more obvious at the national level. Remember, we talked about this when we were talking about the presidential election system, but parties are running those conventions. In some states, the nomination conventions are actually still making decisions. Like in Indiana, at least when I voted there, which was a while ago, only the governor was chosen in the through a primary voting system. All the other statewide offices, Secretary of State, even Lieutenant Governor, were decided in convention. So that means it's just the party elite who are making those decisions together. Okay, so the second function of parties in our system is to operate government. Now, they have to win an election first to be able to operate that government. So again, they have to win first. But then this is another part of their function. So the parties have the responsibility of making sure that government works once they're in power. Now, again, it's not a constitutional responsibility, but because of the fact that we have sort of morphed into having two parties for a variety of reasons, which we'll talk about on Friday, it means that the party that's in power, that has the presidency, that has majority in the House or the Senate or both, right, they're really the ones running the show policy-wise, and they're running the show in terms of appointments to the executive branch. Early on, or initially, that was everything, right? It was a spoil system. The new president came in, they reappointed everybody in the executive branch, which was fine when you only had like 200 people. And it got so unwieldy, right, that even President Lincoln would talk about this because it were constantly people coming to the White House asking for jobs because Lincoln had 5,000 people to appoint at that stage in our development. Now, obviously, there are multiple millions of people who work for the executive branch, and only the very topmost percentages. It depends on the agency what we're talking about, but in no agency is it more than about 1.5% of that workforce is appointed by the president. But that's still like 1,500 people that a president puts in place. So this is what we mean by operating government, at least in terms of like the executive functions of government. But they also operate in Congress, right? They're the ones who are paying attention to policies. They're the ones that are trying to get policies through. And they're the ones that are approving the appointments. Like, remember, the Senate has to confirm all of the executive appointments. And the party is also helping to staff the executive, meaning the actual president's staff. We'll talk more about that when we get to the president, but there's a specific sort of federal agency that's designed to be staff assistants to the president. And so even if your party doesn't win, your party has a role in operating government. And that is, when you are out of power, a party's primary job is to act as the organized opposition, right? I mean, that's fairly obvious in our current context, right? The Democrats spend lots and lots of their time just saying, look how bad the Republicans suck right now, right? Like, that's all that they talk about. And that's because they're operating as an organized opposition. Yes, that's helping them raise money. Yes, that's helping them to work toward electing more Democrats in 6 days. The idea is they're operating as a foil, as a contrast to the ruling party in power, to say, here's another set of alternatives that you could be having if these people weren't in power. That's their job. That's always true, whoever's in the minority. And then finally, the third function of a party is to determine public policy. Now, it's third because you have to be able to win an election and organize the government if you want to really drive the policy operation. See, that's one of the things that people tend to get wrong a lot of times when we think about think about political parties in general parlance, or when we're just talking about politics. We think about parties in terms of ideology. We think about them in terms of the issues that they support or the way that they talk about particular important issues of the day. But honestly and truly, over time, those things can change. The goal to win never does. And that's how you can get a situation where in every Republican platform from 1920 to 1972, they supported an equal rights amendment for women. Now, that changed, but that's because the context of who was voting for Republicans and what they needed to do to continue to hold seats changed. So you can see where over time parties can move around. So they're determining public policy really is just in the context of this administration. They consolidate policy goals. Honestly, one of the I don't know if it's a bug or a feature. It depends on the day how I think about this. But one of the big things that parties do in our system, and it's not necessarily something that we think about explicitly, is that they contain conflict. Why? Because there's only these two big groupings, and one of them is going to win. One of them is going to win an election and be able to operate government. And so many of the sort of smaller policy arguments that people might have actually take place within those parties. And so parties tend to contain conflict because they have an interest in getting to a single answer, right? They have an interest in consolidating those policy goals so that they can win an election. So in determining public policy, lots of times what's going on in the party is that they're sort of bickering among themselves about what that party stands for. There's a ton of political science research, which I think is super interesting, and you probably will if you decide to go to graduate school, but not unless that happens, about how the two parties deal with conflict, right? How they deal with disagreement, how they work toward these consolidated policy goals. And the two parties do it very differently. They have very different internal authority structures. But that's part of how they determine public policy, is that they're consolidating all these possible things they might work on, all these possible ways they might approach it into one set of goals. Then they enumerate those policy goals. That's what's going on in the party platform at the convention. Now, party platforms sometimes are talked about as not being worth the paper they're written on. But the reality is that they're one of the few times and places where parties actually explicitly lay out their agenda, what their goals are, the kind of policies they're trying to get to. And we also know that around 2/3 of the time over the last 100 years or so, the party in power has attempted to achieve the policy goals listed in the platform about 2/3 of the time. So they do tell us something about where the parties are going and what kinds of goals they're enumerating. Also, they are, at least in theory, supposed to be ensuring passage of these policies, right? Why? Because they can't ensure passage unless they have a majority, which they're not going to have unless they win an election. Yes, there is a theme here. They've got to win an election first. All of these other things are secondary to winning the election because they can't do any of these other things unless they win the election. All right, the next section is about the history of political parties. I'm going to kind of see where we are on Friday. This is covered really well in your book, and plus it's straight history. It's about the different eras. We may go through those really quickly, but probably I will shortchange this in order to move us more into talking about the structure of the party and the way the party interacts with the people who are running for office, interacts with citizens. Thank you for your attention, and I hope you guys have a good evening.